Hi, my name is Andrea Goyen, and I'm the Environmental Literacy and Sustainability Coordinator at the San Mateo County Office of Education. In this video, I'm going to walk through how to introduce the climate crisis and explore the impacts of climate change with your students. And this is recommended for students that are upper elementary, secondary, or adults. So I'm going to share my screen and get into it. And you can find all these resources at the URL link below. So www.tinyurl.com/smcoe-climate-ed. Okay, so if you saw the previous video, you'll know that we always introduce this work with showing that there are two human-based environmental crises here. So we've got ecological overshoot and we've got global warming. And the previous segment really does a whole basic introduction to climate change. But just as a reminder, what this looks like is showing that humans have done a tremendous amount of impact and caused destruction on habitats and ecosystems through natural resource depletion, built landscape, and pollution. And the greatest symptom of all of that right now that we've reached a crisis point on is climate change. And it's important to cover the basics of climate change. So again, the previous video did that, but again, here's just a quick example showing the natural greenhouse effect and the human enhanced greenhouse effect side by side. And then bringing kids to this idea of the impacts of climate change. And the rest of this video will really focus on how do you explore those impacts in a way that's trauma informed, but also in a way that is honest and helps people really process the crisis that we're in. So here's the climate emergency. I think it's important to start a segment off on the climate crisis with just understanding the basics of natural and environmental disasters. So defining terms, talking about how natural disasters are major adverse events just related to natural processes of the earth. So think like volcanic explosions, earthquakes, those types of things. Whereas environmental disasters are major adverse events resulting from human impact on environmental systems. Now, the challenge with the climate crisis is that humans are creating, with climate change, more environmental disasters. So geophysical disasters like earthquakes, volcanoes, dry rock falls, landslides, some of these are created by humans and they're environmental crises, but the vast majority are natural. We're starting to see more, though, human ones like earthquakes from fracking or landslides due to ecosystem destruction, that type of thing. And then there's climate related disasters, which again, a number of these can be and are historically natural. But as we are seeing human enhanced climate change, we're recognizing that some of these can be categorized as environmental crises because of the frequency and the intensity of them, that humans have a hand in making these worse and intensifying them. So I think it's useful, again, to introduce the terms, define them, and then show students or ask students like to have their own personal moment. How many have you had in your lifetime? Which of these are sudden? Which are gradual? What's the impact on the communities? So you can start that process of them kind of making connections between their own life and their previous knowledge, and also starting to tap into the emotions where they're thinking about, oh, how does this really impact the communities? Then I think it's important to then bring back this image and really think about, okay, so which of these issues, which of these disasters is most concerning to you? And it might also be good to ask students, like, which ones do you not know, or which ones have you never heard of? Which ones do you want to learn more about? Which ones do you not understand? Just giving them a chance to ease into it. Now, if you're teaching younger students, I definitely think it's important to define the term crisis, and or all students, but in particular for younger students, it might be that you kind of stop around here. You define the term crisis, you explain to them there's a report that was written in 2018 by the IPCC, and that report shared that we're actually already in the climate crisis. And so we began a shift from anticipating it to realizing that we're experiencing it. If you want to, with younger students, you can go a little further and talk about how in the next decade, we're going to experience more climate emergencies. In the 2 decades after that, there is predicted to be widespread emergencies. And then after that, we're very, very concerned about what's going to happen. Now, with secondary students and adults, I would definitely use the data and I would use the terminology so that they really understand the seriousness of it. But all of this needs to be couched with some trauma-informed practices. So if I was teaching younger students, I would probably pause here and use these slides, like what emotions are you experiencing? What questions do you have? And then do some trauma-informed practices. If I'm working with secondary students or adults, I would typically go a little bit further and actually show them some of that data that goes along with the slide that showed about the projection of more disasters. So it showed this slide that's connecting data about the number of geophysical disasters remaining pretty stable while the number of climate-related disasters has greatly increased. So again, just showing the data, helping students really understand what's happening, the truth of the crisis. And here's another way to get at the graph. So some people like, different styles of graphs. So sometimes it's good to show different examples. And again, another example with a bar graph this time. So lots of different ways to get at it with different images, but just to help students understand and explore the data. Again, with secondary and adult students, I would do the same thing. I'd pause and reflect here. What are the emotions they're experiencing? What questions do they have? And what more do they want to learn? And again, doing a trauma-informed practice, I think, is really important. And we have lots of resources there. You can check them out using this link. So I highly encourage people to go further, especially with secondary students and adults. I would not use these coming slides with elementary school students unless you want to just focus in on one issue. But I definitely think that these can be used if used appropriately with secondary students and definitely adults. And I like to do this segment as thinking about what is the projection of disasters and issues that we're projected to experience for a student who's currently in kindergarten. So really thinking about like what is the next 20 years of their life going to look like, and helping people kind of frame that in their own experience. So in particular, if you're working with adults, really thinking through like what has been their own experience. So starting with indicator, we're going to start with heat. So I was going through this, and I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because you can go back and look at the slide deck. But as you go through this, you'll see that we'll have definitions, like the definition of extreme heat, and then this question of how do you feel on a high heat day? So it's going to go back and forth between defining it, giving data, and having people reflect it to their own personal experience. This is a really important way to go through the data so that people are really feeling it and they're not shutting down, but they're having an interactive experience, but you're doing it in a way that's framing it to protect their emotions as opposed to just like laying on data and data and data. But it is important to show the data. So talking through the fact that heat is a leading cause of death, giving some examples of what's gone on high heat days, and then showing what's the realities for California. So currently we experience an average of 25 heat days a year. By 2050, that's expected to double. Ask people their emotional reaction to it, then connect it back to schools. Show this idea that we've got a lot of students in California that go to school every single day. And for the most part, their school grounds are managed with asphalt. And that is a problem for high heat. So there's not a lot of tree canopy, which means that there's very little shade on high heat days. So this is where you can introduce that idea of heat island effect. Urban heat island effect. And this is a really great unit and a really great concept for middle schoolers in particular and high schoolers, because they're used to experiencing the high heat. They spend a lot of time outdoors. You could even do this with elementary school students. So like I said before, like you can pick some of these individual topics and really focus in on them with elementary school students. And this might be one that's really relevant because they're outside playing in their schoolyards. Drought is also a very important topic to cover in connection to heat. So really going through the concept of drought, having an understanding that we go up and down with drought in the state of California, but we're projected to see a lot more drought. So going a little bit further, you can ask students and adults, like, what did it feel like to live through drought seasons? Walk them through a couple of the more recent drought seasons. And then show projections for the future. Again, pausing to ask about emotional reactions. Then the next thing that's kind of in that suite of high heat and drought and everything is wildfire. So this one has absolutely mandatory that this one is couched with trauma-informed practices. There is not hardly a Californian anymore that has not had some direct impact from a wildfire. So really making sure that you're defining it and then asking people immediately, what experiences do you have? Let people share that, get their stories out, let them make those personal connections so that they understand that they're in a safe space where other people have also had experiences. Then talk about what have the projections been? What has been the realities of the data, and what is going to be moving forward? CAL FIRE does have some projection maps, and they are looking to do some updated maps as well. But talking about that, we're expected to see quite an increase in the amount of wildfires that will be burning across California. Again, connecting things back to school, really important. This is the reality that our students and the adults in our education system are experiencing, which is that we're seeing a lot of school closure days due to wildfires. In fact, that's the leading impact right now in California from climate change on schools. So something else to think about is public power safety shutoffs. So really letting people get a chance to think about that when we're projected to have so many more days of wildfires. And when you look at that, Californians will also have 140 days a year with high wildfire potential. What would that feel like to have public power shutoffs all the time? And getting people to really think about, like, we're going to need to do something different, right? Like this is as we how we elevate the sense of urgency, again, doing it safely, really noticing the emotions of students, but also helping them really think about, like, yeah, that's what crisis is about. We're in an urgent situation. This has to connect to air quality, of course. When we're talking about wildfires, we can't not talk about that. That's one of the biggest issues with wildfires in the state of California, is the air quality problems and issues. So it might be important to go back and define issues around air quality, in particular what ozone is, and thinking about lower atmosphere and upper atmosphere. Showing a couple of the common sources of particulate matter can be helpful. Again, just really helping students understand data and the realities of things. And this is data that is like the current status. We are experiencing an increase in the amount due to wildfires. And then showing just some of the recent data, showing some of the pictures, again, really making sure that we're holding on to the emotional impact of what things like hearing about accelerating lung aging, asthma, and probably many of your students will have asthma, that idea of having a shortened lifespan. All of these things are very intense for the emotions. So that's the issues of high heat and drought and wildfires. I'm going to shift now to water-related issues. So showing the indicators around sea level rise. Sea level rise is the average long-term global rise of the ocean surface, helping people understand that we are already experiencing sea level rise. This is not something that's happening in 100 years. It's already happening now. The data here is for the state of California. So thinking through the amount of sea level rise that is anticipated. And then, of course, I'm in San Mateo County, so showing the local data and helping people understand that San Mateo County is the most vulnerable county to sea level rise. See, it's surrounded on both sides here by water, and it has already experienced 2 to 6 inches of sea level rise since 2050 or since 1950. So really helping your students understand that the crisis has begun. This is impacting our daily life, and it's accelerated a lot over the last 10 years. Also showing some images of, like, what do we really mean by sea level rise? I sometimes think people feel like sea level rise is going to be these giant tsunami waves. And it's not really that. It's really more like what you see on a king tide day. Yes, it is huge and there is flooding. And you want students to think about, what would it feel like to have flooding like this on a regular basis? Like every time we have high tide, this is what it would be like. And showing some images again of where this has already been happening in the county. So, and then showing that this is not just in our area, but also it's across the United States, and it's of course across the world, and places where they're really actually are dealing with it in a much more dramatic way, especially in Florida and in the Carolinas and in New Jersey. I think it's also important to show the technicalities of some of these issues. So what are some of the things that are the worst impacts of sea level rise? So yes, it means raising water levels, and you see pictures of, like, oh, people walking through water, but thinking about what's below the surface. So thinking about, how will this impact our stormwater, and how will this impact drainage, and how will this impact our potable drinking water? So again, thinking through risks and what kind of impacts do we have. And there's so much credible information out there about this in California because California is so vulnerable to sea level rise. Switching from sea level rise now to heavy precipitation. So heavy precipitation is an important thing for people to understand, especially because we talked about drought earlier. So a lot of people will forget, like, oh yeah, we also have like really heavy rainstorms though. And that's part of the issues of climate change, is this whiplash between dry and wet. So helping students understand terms that maybe are pretty new. In fact, they're pretty new to adults. This idea of an atmospheric river that carries a ton of water. And this is what we meant. This is what I meant before about the intensity of storms. So we're seeing much bigger storms that are going beyond what we would consider normal. You can get a sense that, yeah, this is definitely increasing. And you can ask people to go back to that personal piece of like, how does that impact your life? Is there flooding on the way to work? Do you have to do things in your home to protect your house? And again, showing data and the frequency that is anticipated as we go forward. Another thing, I think that it is really relevant here to really dive into that data. It's a great math lesson. It helps people really understand this idea of how many times they would experience a storm that is said to be only in 100 years. So I think it was Houston that in the last decade has experienced 3 storms that were storms that you would say would have in the past only been on record once every 100 years. They had 3 in 1 decade, right? So this is the important piece of understanding how heavy precipitation is increasing in frequency as well. So going to another indicator now, which is agriculture, really understanding how is climate change going to impact the agriculture system. So California is, of course, an agricultural state. It's got ag industry all over the place. You can look at find your own county and have an understanding of what your county produces. Also, this is connected to fishing, right? So we've got a lot of issues around fishing that are related to climate change and are not related to climate change, but in particular, these ones are related to climate change. Kelp forest decline, ocean acidification, ocean temperature rising. Overfishing is one of those ones that is a bit of a stretch to connect it to climate change, but it's one of those human impacts on the ecosystem. But it does have, overfishing does impact the overall ecosystem, which of course connects back to climate change. So that's a good segue into another indicator, which is biodiversity. So again, making sure you're defining the term, giving people a chance to connect personally to the term. So thinking about biodiversity, giving people a chance to have that emotional connection to animals and plants and think about their favorite ones, then getting into some of this data. And I think this is a really important slide or really important image graph, because it shows that the vast majority of biodiversity loss is in fact not a climate change created problem. It's actually all the other human impacts that we have, like habitat degradation, exploitation, pollution, some invasive species. However, climate change comes in and just exacerbates that issue. So you can see here, walking students through that to understand that climate change is not the only reason that we're having biodiversity loss. There's a lot more reasons that are contributing to it, but climate change is there to just kind of tip it over the edge. I think it's sometimes nice to do activities that really help people visualize it. So this is a pretty simple simulation activity where you can have, if you're in a classroom with students, you can have them all stand up. If you're on distance learning, you can have everybody go to gallery mode so that they can see the screen. And then you can ask people to cover up their thing like this so that you get a sense of what percentage of the class, if they were terrestrial land animals, would be extinct. Or if they were freshwater animals, you'd ask 80% of the students to go like this on their screen so that you'd get this visual of a bunch of black squares. And that's helping people understand what it means to have 80% of these species going to decline or extinct. Last topic here is important to bring all of this back to humans and really think about what's happening with immigration and refugees, and the fact that climate change is causing an absolute refugee crisis in our world, and really understanding the severity of it. There's a lot of videos you can show here. There's a lot of different research to bring in, but it's just important that students really understand, in particular, the injustice of this issue. So countries who have done very little to contribute to the climate crisis are experiencing the most devastating impacts and are the ones who are becoming refugees first. And again, climate change is just this multiplier that amplifies inequities So there's a lot that you can do here, in particular with upper secondary students, to really understand like things like redlining and understand climate injustices. And I'm not saying don't talk about that with younger students too, definitely do, but you can go way deeper into these issues with your upper grade levels and with adult learners. So that's a lot. There's a lot of stuff in there. I just want to pause and have people think about, how do you help people handle the emotional impact of seeing all those indicators at once? Probably most people are going to feel fairly shut down. Again, the goal of having all those interactive moments and all those opportunities to share your personal feelings and other things is to make sure that people aren't feeling shut down. And if they are, just be open about it. Like, yeah, crisis. Like, most people experience feeling shut down when faced with crisis. That's totally a normal reaction. And the goal here is to show people the data and to get them to understand that we're in a crisis so that we can move forward, not so that we're going to dwell in it and go into despair and doom, but more just so that we understand the severity and the urgency of the situation, and we're going to move forward from there. Also important to ask always, what questions do students have? Again, back to this idea of showing a trauma-informed practice. I highly recommend doing some nature connection ones. So here's a document that has nature connection activities. In particular, ones for this are useful are solo sit spots in nature, practicing gratitude, doing journal writing, doing some nature meditations. All of these things are things to calm down the emotions around the idea that we are in a crisis. And lastly, I would say something else to point students to is to doing some research on their own. And it might feel more comfortable to do to actually enter with research as opposed to a direct instruction style of this, so that students are getting the chance to explore that stuff on their own. And so here's the climate crisis and impact section. So it's the second section of the WebQuest. The first section is for just basic introduction to climate change and global warming. So this one is more of these key reports and data and projections. We've got all the big ones, like ones from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The US Global Change Research Program has really, really interesting assessment reports. You could go into the meteorological data. I think that this is more of like a, if people are more narrative based as opposed to data based, it might be good to start with The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, which really gives this incredibly powerful image of what it's going to feel like in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. A couple of the things to look through in this WebQuest are some of the data and indicators at the state level and at the local level. So it's sometimes really interesting to play around with that data and just get a better sense of what these projections really mean. I think this is a little bit more for adults, but I think it's also important for maybe upper secondary students to explore, like, what are some of these health issues associated with climate change, in particular mental health and physical health. And again, asking students to actually like connect this to their own life. How do they experience the mental health, or what do they experience mentally and physically when they see all these issues related to climate change? Or if they've experienced any of them personally, what has it felt like physically and mentally to go through some of these disasters? Lastly, there's information here on migration as well. So that is a lot of information, and hopefully you're able to get a good start with going through the impacts of climate change with your students.